So our first speaker today is Sean Bryan from PestFix. He'll be talking about controlling gulls without a license. Can we all say without a license, really, Natalie? But yeah, Sean, without further ado, I will leave you to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Apologies for the background. I am in a car, so I managed to bribe the children to be quiet this morning with sweets and goodies. And then Vodafone decided to turn up and start drilling the wall. So apologies for the video. I'm going to talk to you today about gull control and how that's changed since various license changes. Hopefully everyone can see the video. Start off with, what birds are not protected by legislation. Hopefully everyone on the webinar here knows that all birds are protected underneath the Wildlife and Countryside Act. It offers all birds a basic level of protection, which means that the birds themselves, their young, their eggs, their nests are protected by law. And it's an offence then to intentionally kill or injure or take wild birds, as well as destroy their nests or destroy the eggs of any wild bird. Within the pest management sector, naturally, we do still control birds. So how do we do it? In the 90s, Natural England came up with a scheme of general licensing, which were introduced to allow lethal methods of control legally under certain circumstances. So, for instance, under Natural England, there is now a general license to kill or take wild birds to preserve public health or public safety under GL 35. There are also other general licenses for preserving crops, for air safety around airports and so on. In those instances, we'll obviously operate under those licenses, but typically within the pest management sector, we're more concerned with birds that are damaging public health or public safety. So GL 35 is the type that we would use. So under Natural England's scheme of general licensing, there are different ones for Wales and Scotland. There are now only 7 birds that can be controlled under a general license. They're on the screen now in front of you, but they include the carrion crow, jackdaw, magpie, feral pigeon, the rook, Canada goose, and monk parakeet. So this is only where there is a public health or safety threat. So the general license isn't a license that we have to apply for. They're automatically generated at the beginning of a year, and providing certain circumstances there, so you can prove that there is a public health and safety concern and that there aren't any non-lethal methods of control. We can control the birds on that screen without having to apply for a special license. Please note, if you're operating in Wales or Scotland, they have their own general licensing. So each devolved nation have their own license conditions. And in Wales and Scotland, it's only the feral pigeon now that applies on their general license. So once they're issued, normally the licenses are issued on the 1st of January, and they normally last to the year's end. This year in England, they were only valid until the end of July, and then new licenses were issued on the 1st of August following a review. Individual licenses, though, for gulls were released on the 15th of March if they were applied for. So you had to apply specifically for the licenses that you needed. Those were broadly site-specific because no gulls now apply on the general license. You had to apply for an individual, and you had to determine which species it was and for what reason you were trying to control. I've put down that expect more changes. So general licensing for bird control in the UK has been broadly static since we started. However, with various challenges coming from different wildlife groups, the licenses are continuously being reviewed. We're continuously looking for how do we make it better, not just for pest management, but also for preserving wild bird populations. I think we've all seen that wild birds have depleted by significant percentages year on year, and certainly since like the 60s and 70s, it's a high percentage of birds that have been lost to various reasons, not down to pest management. So a key thing for anyone that's involved in bird control is making sure that you keep up to date. There are always news flashes. BPCA release a lot of the information as well. PestFix do too. Make sure that you're keeping up to date with the changes that happen. So how can you manage pest birds that do not appear in the general license? So there's a few things you can do. One, if you absolutely must control them lethally, you must apply for a site-specific or individual license. So that's not just if you're shooting birds, that includes egg and nest removal, egg oiling, egg pricking, anything that you need to do where you're going to be disturbing a nesting bird, you must apply for a site-specific or individual license for bird control. There's a link here. I'm sure that you will find this on BPCA's website. It's on ours, but there are links here. This one is a link to the Natural England online application. There are separate ones for Scotland and Wales. You have to list the species of birds you intend to take or kill. So when you're talking about gulls, make sure that you're careful with your identification. Make sure that you know whether it's a herring gull, a greater blackback, lesser blackback gull, and make sure that you stipulate, if it's multiple species, make sure you stipulate that on your license application. You need to also identify the reason for them to be controlled, and there needs to be generally a public health or safety threat that you're trying to mitigate. Someone saying that they're having their cars fouled on wouldn't necessarily tick that box. There needs to be something, a reason that you need to control the birds that's going to preserve public health and safety. What I had seen previously, and it does seem to change, different people that I've spoken to have different licenses, but generally when most of the licenses that I've seen when people have applied for an individual license, it came across that they were covered across various counties of England. More recently, the license that I've seen are specific to each individual site. So if you have multiple contracts for falconry, egg and nest removal and so on, you would need to apply for each individual site. I would certainly advise making sure that you've included every site. You'd rather be over licensed than under licensed, and opening yourself up to potential legislation. Once you've got your license, you can then authorize others to operate underneath your license. So if you have technicians that work for you or you subcontract certain works out, you can authorize other people to undertake the works on that license, on the individual license, but you would need to make sure they've got a copy and they understand what they are allowed to do and what they're not. On the license itself, it will say what actions can be taken. What we have seen as well is the number of licenses granted across England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. There certainly seems to be a limit on the number of licenses that are being issued, naturally to try and stop us reducing the population of birds in various sites of the UK. Where you do need a license, make sure that you're applying as early as possible. On the screen is just an example of the type of licenses that I've seen issued. These ones were from last year, but they're very similar this year, but it will stipulate who is actually on the license, where the license applies to. So for instance, area valid, what counties of England. It will then stipulate what species of bird and what means that those birds can be controlled by. So some of the examples on here would be pricking of eggs, oiling of eggs, destruction of eggs and nests by hand. But it could be that you've applied to carry out lethal method control for shooting or cage traps. That will be stipulated on the license that you receive. So where you don't have a license and the birds still need to be controlled, what can you do? So I would always say proofing is a number one go-to method of control. It will work across all species of all levels of pressure of birds. So low pressure being, maybe a loafing site or a day roost, medium pressure sites where it's a natural food source or a night roost, and then high pressure anywhere that you've got nesting birds or an artificial food source. Proofing will offer a 100% guarantee if it's installed correctly. What you do need to do though, if you are looking at proofing, is you still need to make sure it's not stopping a bird accessing its nest. So if it is a nest site, make sure that you're waiting until those birds are fledged, the nest is no longer in use, and then you can clear away those nests and carry out the proofing. So for instance, for gulls, we're now in the time of year where proofing can be undertaken without any real risk of you actually stopping a bird accessing its nest. Other things to bear in mind would be environmental management. So as pest managers, not all of us will undertake this work, but if you're au fait with it, things like grounds maintenance, tree and shrub pruning, for example, litter picking, moving waste. These things can be added either to your own contracts or advice to clients to make sure they're doing everything they can to try and make the area less attractive to pest birds. Housekeeping, I put on there, keeping bin lids closed. The amount of times that we see birds feeding from open bins, just putting a lid on will help. But removing food waste, some of the food sites that we go to, naturally there's an element of waste. Can that be stored in an undercover area? Can they move the bins further away from the building so it makes it less of an issue for staff and visitors? Proactive pest bird management. So where you do have customers that are contracting your services on an ongoing basis, I would always say it's best practice to try and give advice on how they can try and prevent it. Areas where there may be high risk of bird activity, if you know that you've just put a roof net on a building next door, chances are those birds are going to move over. What can they do to try and get ahead of a potential problem? Other things that you can do, and what I'm seeing more often now from people like Natural England and the Welsh and Scottish equivalents are there is an expectation on non-lethal methods being tried first. So PestFix as a company, we've had a massive surge in orders for things like bioacoustic deterrents, visual deterrents, and not always because it's trying to solve a problem, but Natural England certainly are stipulating that they need evidence or proof that people have tried other methods. To give an idea, there's been a fair few sites now where a pest manager has applied for a license on a site and said that they tried Hawkeyes, and they were asked for evidence, either photographic or invoices, to show that they had brought Hawkeyes and put them on that site. It's not across the board, but it's some of the challenges that we've seen back at PestFix. So bioacoustic deterrents, so you have fixed audible deterrents. How do they work? They generally will play the distress call of the pest bird that you're trying to control, or the call of a predatory bird. Is it going to work in every instance? No. You will find on nest sites, on artificial food sites, they will be limited in how well they will work as a standalone product. However, used alongside other maybe visual deterrents or Hawkeyes, deterrent gels, laser deterrents, for instance, they will get a different level of result. If your client is a food site where they need to have they have a zero tolerance, these options here won't give them 100% guarantee. But what they may do is help to control the population, or put yourself in a place where you can apply for a special license or an individual license to actually get lethal methods of control or proofing requirements that you need on that site. So when you're recommending these types of deterrent, make sure that before you do so, you've thought about the level of bird pressure on site. So proofing systems, one of the slowest features I think you can put on PowerPoint. Proofing systems must not trap or otherwise harm birds or other animals. So if you are installing netting, make sure that you've surveyed exactly where the birds are and where the netting is going to block, and make sure that you're not installing netting that's going to block birds into an enclosed area. The Animal Welfare Act does put joint responsibility on the installer and the building owner to make sure no birds become trapped. Netting also sometimes can fall foul of local planning restrictions. That is down to the building owner to make sure that they've applied for any specific licensing, but make sure that you've made the customer aware. When and why proof? Well, why is 100% effective when installed professionally. Proofing can be carried out once the birds have fledged the nest without having to apply for a license. It should be seen as a humane method of prevention as well. So netting, if it's installed correctly, you shouldn't get birds being tangled. If spikes and so on, people hear spikes and think it's going to impale a bird. We all know that that's not what they're used for. It's to move birds away. It can be installed discreetly. So at PestFix, and I'm sure there are other suppliers that see the same thing. A lot of the time people ask for a black net, but there are other colours available, stone, translucent, or some people see it as white. You can use different coloured netting to try and make it less obvious. You've also got other methods of proofing, so things like Birdshock Flex Track, which is a piece of track that's very, very minimal in terms of aesthetic appearance, but can work very effectively across all bird pressures. What we're doing when we're proofing it is not to try and harm the birds. It's not to try and stop them breeding. It's just to stop them being on the buildings that you're trying to protect. So it encourages the birds to go and find alternative places to be. So it's seen as a humane method of control. From a pest manager's perspective, there is, and we're all in it, I suppose, to make profit, I would hope. There is more profit in proofing over lethal methods, which one is a low revenue sort of builder, but it's also something that doesn't necessarily get the customer a full level of control. It's unlikely if you've got 1,000 nesting gulls that you'll be able to shoot or dispatch all of those even under a special license. So it's offering your client a lot more, longer term benefits, a lot more value in the money that they're spending with you. It's also much better advice for them in the long term too. And thirdly, whilst we are pest managers, we're also, a lot of us now, a lot more environmentally friendly and a lot more environmentally aware. There's long-term benefits to wild bird populations over lethal control. If we encourage them to be elsewhere, they can still thrive. Wildlife does adapt. So if we're pushing them somewhere else, it's a good thing. As a pest manager, from a business perspective, I certainly say if you're going to carry out proofing systems, make sure you leave some sort of calling cards to say who installed it, so yourself. If there's a problem then with that net, or if there's a next door neighbour that wants to, copy what their neighbour's done, make sure you leave your calling card. We see it a lot with roofing companies and conservatory installers and so on. You'll normally see that they will leave a calling card to say who installed the netting, who installed spikes. It'll help you massively in terms of generating repeat business. The cost of demounting and reinstating there, I'll put this on as a point, a lot of rooftops and so on will change their plant equipment over time, and the cost of demounting and reinstating a net for maintenance, for example, can sometimes be as much as the original installation. If you've left your calling card, chances are you should get that work. Not always, but it's certainly a greater chance than if you just leave the net there. Make sure you leave a plaque in with your name and calling card. You can also leave these on things like posted wire, spikes, bioacoustics, laser deterrent systems, and so on. PestFix, and I'm sure some of our other suppliers, we can make these up for you. There's a small charge for printing, but you can get a pack of these put up together. It will leave your number, your name, your website, whatever you need it to be. Whilst having gulls removed from the general licenses does change things, I wouldn't argue necessarily it makes it better or worse. I think there are benefits to be had. The good thing from a pest management perspective is it shows more of a consultative approach rather than just trying to react when there is a problem. Encourages the customer to action your recommendations you make. So I would argue if a customer is asking you to try and get rid of a bird problem that they have on their building, make sure that you're putting within your normal reports what you've done, what you've been asked for, and any recommendations you've made, like closing the door. I think shooting birds inside where customers are forever leaving the doors open, I think that will become increasingly difficult in the future. So make sure that you're leaving a written report given the recommendations that you set. I think also a lot of us on this call now, the reason that we sit on such digital forums is because we want to be as professional as we can be to make sure we're as skilled as we can be. And I would argue knowing what the legislation is in terms of general licensing will show your level of professionalism much higher. Understanding what the general licenses look like, what's stipulated, and how you can get special licenses and individual licenses. A lot of the time, a lot of the cowboy outfits, if I call them that, they don't do this. So you can show yourself to be the professional that you are. I would argue it also sets a proactive approach to pest management. So rather than getting that phone call in the middle of June when the gulls are nesting, by giving the advice that general licenses and special licenses have changed, you can get customers buy-in now when they're looking at budgets that maybe start in the beginning of 2021. You can start talking to customers about how they're going to remedy and action some of the recommendations to remove the pest birds on their site. Also gives you more time to plan and book the works in rather than having to try and jump up and down and react to some of the problems that are there. The other benefit is if you are a company that doesn't just do pest management, but you also include cleaning, maybe grounds maintenance, ecological surveys, for instance, or minor building works, you can potentially add these services on up front to help reduce the risk of there being any bird populations on a building. So there's a good chance here of it's not just trying to sell everything to the customer, but it's a good chance for your business to have as many different arms and many different irons in the fire, if you like. The other bit that I find works really well with a lot of the pest managers that we deal with, it gives you a good chance to network with other trades. So if a building has a roof population of gulls, potentially you're going to be there to solve the netting side of things, but maybe there's leaks being caused by the birds, so you can get in roofers or building contractors and so on. By working with these different customers and bringing work their way, a lot of the time what you'll find is that's reciprocated and you'll get work coming back when they notice there's a pest infestation on another building. So from my experience and from working with a lot of people that do this really well, anyone that's networking with other trades tends to do really, really well out of it. Other benefits that you're going to find, so reduction in call out. So having been on this side, I've been on the side of it that you are, the call outs never happen when you're 2 minutes around the corner and you've got some time to spare. It's always a Friday night when you don't want to go out, or it's going to be a time when you've got so much work on you're struggling to fit the call out in. By having a proactive approach to bird control, you're reducing the number of call outs you're going to get, and ultimately makes your life a lot better. And for whoever's indoors, less chance of you having to rush out and ruin date night. Opportunity for further business. So moving the birds on, you can then follow those birds and find out where they went. They're quite a visual pest, so you can see where they've moved to. It gives you a chance to speak to your customers, neighbours, and say, look, you're doing certain works, you may get a problem. It's almost like the gas man approach of when there's a gas leak, they don't just go to the one area, they go and speak to the neighbours and tell them that there potentially is a gas leak in the area. It gives you a chance to go and find other business close to where you had other contracts. We don't tend to see as much leaflet drops as so much, or certainly not in pest management, but there's a chance for you to go and drop your card or leaflets in and explain what you're doing in the area. I would certainly say digital marketing, things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram even is generally crying out, so is LinkedIn. But you've also got things like local media, so radio, TV. If you're doing something quite interesting, so I don't know, let's say it was a laser installation to deter pest birds, a lot of local media outlets will lap that up. Get yourself some free PR if you can. So go back to basics a little bit here. So we should always be exploring all methods of non-lethal control first and ruling them out as impracticable. So proofing is normally one of the first things on the list. You can still carry out bird control and it's still very achievable. So I would argue from ourselves, proofing has definitely taken off. We certainly are seeing a lot less orders for things like traps and shooting equipment, but we are seeing a much higher uptake in bird proofing equipment. So that's certainly moving forward. So don't think that bird control is now impossible. It's certainly not. What I would argue is don't get led by your customer. A lot of customers still know what it used to be like 5 years ago, where you could just carry out a shoot and have a shooting contract. I believe shooting contracts, trapping contracts are going to be something of a history. Make sure that you're obviously giving the right advice and the best advice, and that lethal control should be a last resort. And the reason that I would say this is we've seen many, many changes within the pest management sector. So things like crew, insecticide stewardship plans, which may be on the case, health and safety and how that's changed. I would argue bird control should also change. And broadly, it is at the moment. Hopefully that covered off some of the questions that you might have, but I'm sure there's going to be some questions at the moment coming through. Thanks for listening. My number is there, should anyone want to have a conversation offline about this as well.
Great, thank you, Siobhan. That was amazing. Would you just about to stop sharing your screen and then we can go skip through some questions? It's interesting what you say about the orders that you're experiencing, and you can see a reduction in, the kill methods, if you like, and certainly more in the proactive proofing side of things. It's interesting.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Okay, so I think we've got 5 questions here. There's a possibility some of them came in quite early, so maybe we answered them during the presentation there, but I'll get going with them. So, hello, I have a question regarding general licenses for bird control. What kind of proofing do we operators need? What kind of proof do we need to gather to show that non-lethal alternatives have been tried and have failed? And does this evidence need to be submitted to any authority?
So historically, I would argue that there was very little evidence that we needed to prove. We could just write down that certain options, let's say a Hawkeye, had been installed, and very little challenge came back. This year, we've certainly come across a number of customers that have said this and then been asked to prove either with photographic evidence of the Hawkeye on the building, or whether it's through invoicing and so on, where that customer has brought, let's say, a Hawkeye from them. So I would say if you've got photographic evidence, if you've got video evidence, works very well now. It's tricky to get that into a form, but if you've got a video that you can send as a backup on an email of, let's say, bioacoustics installed, Hawkeyes, if you show that you've done tree shrubbery, if you've got invoices or treatment reports to show what you've done as non-lethal, put that into the report as much as possible. You can't put too much information in the applications.
Yeah, great. I think having a process, if you do a lot of bird management, having a process already planned so that you've got this record keeping system, isn't it? And where you're going to keep all the information in a folder, so that if you do need it, it's there, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Good stuff. That answered it well. So next one. Does setting up netting to stop gulls roosting count as control, or is this separate?
So netting is really a management tool. You're going to control the gulls on, let's say it's a netting system on a roof. Netting will control the gulls and stop them being on that part of the building. However, some buildings will have multiple sites all on the same plot. So just because you've netted one roof doesn't mean that you'll get a general license, a special license to go and carry out lethal methods of control on the others. if you've installed netting really well in one part of the building, it's proved to be effective. Chances are, if you apply for a special license somewhere else, they're going to say, hang on a minute, you used netting elsewhere, you didn't have to kill a gull, and it worked effectively. Do the same on this building once they're fledged. So yes, it does. It counters control, but it's not lethal methods of control. It's humane.
Absolutely. And if it ends up being lethal, then there's a problem with the net, eh?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
I think that's the thing we need to be careful of as well, is, with all these action groups out there and, individuals that are eager to obviously, save pigeons and protect them, of course, as all animals should have. But when it comes to netting, if you get a bird caught in there, if it's, a bit saggy in one area or got a hole somewhere and something gets caught in there, people have got camera phones and, it's a quick thing for them to get out there. So we've got to be careful, haven't we?
Yeah, very true.
Great. So how can it be ensured that general licenses for bird control are only used by professional pest controllers or have had proper training and not by others who lack the training, i.e. there's some examples there. I won't read them out, so I don't want to offend anybody.
No. So the general license isn't designed for pest management only. It is for building owners or landowners. The general licenses that we use are for preserving public health and safety, but there are others that apply specifically for crops, livestock, air safety and so on. So it's not always a pest manager that's going to carry out the works. The general licenses do stipulate how and what actions can be taken and what shouldn't be done. However, you're always asking that the person who's actually following that general license is doing so in accordance with it and doing it safely. I don't think there will ever be a time when it will say only by pest managers. I could be wrong, but it should be the people that operate under that license should be doing so in a way that they know what they're doing. But it doesn't stipulate it must be by a pest controller.
Yeah. A bit like some of the products that we use, not so much rodenticides, but it's competence, isn't it? And if something was to go wrong, that's when authorities would decide, I think, wouldn't they, whether or not that person was trained enough or professional enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we see it in proofing as well for rodent control. We may, as pest managers, quote to block that hole, and we'll know what products we'll need to use. But the client will decide to get a builder in who will just use expanding foam, and we all know rodents will chew through that in an instant. So it's just trying to advise the client as to what the best remedies are, I would argue, and hoping that they follow your advice.
Absolutely. It's always the challenge. So we had a few anonymous questions there. We've got Kevin Anderson asking a question now. I said I'd read your names out if you put them on there, so I hope you don't mind. What can you do if you get a call about a bird going into an enclosed building or warehouse, which needs to be quickly removed?
So if a bird goes in, so if it's on the general license already, so I've read the list of birds that are on the general license in the UK, in England, sorry. If it's on that license, you can generally control that through a shoot. However, the first steps of any bird going into a building is, can you scare it out humanely? So can you turn the lights off, open the door, be quiet, and hope that you encourage the bird to leave? I'm assuming this question more relates to where you cannot scare the bird out. In that instance, I would suggest, if it's not on the general license, I would argue with, is there a way that this bird had continuously got in? Was it through an open door that's always left open? If it is, shooting that one bird isn't going to stop the next bird coming in. My first step would be speak to someone like Natural England, get them on the phone and explain to them the scenario you're in. Because if you do shoot the bird and without a license, it's you that's going to end up in court. So I would rather not shoot that bird and come back at a later date, even if that doesn't make the customer happy, without someone giving you authorization to do so. I have seen, where birds have got into food sites where someone said, phone Natural England. Natural England have not given a authorization as such, but they've said, look, and under these circumstances, if you can show why you're doing it, write this down, record this evidence, then you can have a retrospective license issued. But that's come from Natural England. It's not coming from PestFix or BPCA. It's come from the licensing body. That would be my point, the first point, to have that authorization given before you do it. If you apply for a license, generally now they're coming back quite quickly, within a week to 2 weeks, most of the customers that I'm speaking to. So yes, it's not ideal in a food premise, but food premises do have different licenses issued normally at the beginning of the year. And if you have a food site, you can apply for a license for certain birds that get inside of a site, and they can have a license.
Fabulous, great. We'll get some more questions coming through. We've got 10 racking up now. We've got 5 or 6 minutes left, so hopefully, so how we do, we might get through them. How effective is bird deterrent gel for deterring pigeons from building ledges, medium pressure, town centre type building?
So with any deterrent, I would say that you don't get a specific level of result, but we sell bird deterrent gels, and I would say it's probably one of our biggest growing, the biggest growing demand for other products that we've got. It's fairly low cost, fairly aesthetically pleasing. On a medium pressure site, I would say it would work quite well. Certainly low pressure works very well. Medium pressure, I'd say it works fairly well. On a high pressure site, I wouldn't lead with it if it was my site, simply because the birds sometimes will overcome it. But medium pressure, low pressure, we've got a lot of pest controllers that use it a lot of the time, and they swear by it. So I know that's anecdotal, because there are always some sites where it doesn't work, but there are a lot of sites where it works perfectly well.
Yeah, that's a great question from Stephen Parker. We get a few of those, does it work, doesn't it work? And, as you said, it's very site specific. So great. So from Besnick Vrels, which pricing mythology do you use when call outs from the client? So which pricing mythology do you use when call out from the client? If you can briefly describe entire process from the moment you receive the call from client till you submit the offer. If that's something you feel you can input in, Sean, can you?
So it's a tricky one because everyone works differently. If it's a brand new customer, then are you pricing the survey? Some people offer free surveys, a free call out for their existing customers. It depends on what you've got contractually. It'll also depend on travel time and so on. So there's a lot of questions there to be answered in one bit. I would argue if you're ever going to price it, I'm sure you would have worked out your hourly rate and apply that, plus any preparation that you're going to use to respond, same as you would for rodents, insects. If someone needs a detailed inspection, maybe you offer a consultancy fee, but it all depends on, I guess, your client and who it is it responds to. A residential is unlikely to want to take you up on a consultancy fee, but a big developer, construction developer may. So I'd say it depends.
Fabulous. From Rafael here. Hi, you mentioned that nests could be removed outside of the season to allow proofing measures to be installed. Would this apply to other species other than gulls, i.e. starlings or protected species?
So providing it's a species that fledge and aren't nesting year round. So pigeons nest year round, but starlings, most of the time they do fledge and leave the nest, and they've got a specific nesting period, which is generally between March and May. As long as they are not actively nesting at that time, yes. As long as the birds have fledged, it will apply to any species. As long as it's not an active nest.
Great. So furthermore, could nests be removed annually during the winter without any proofing measures being applied?
Yes. So if it's if it's not an active nest, you can remove the nest in the winter time, which takes away a lot of the debris that's on the roof, but it doesn't solve the problem throughout the nesting period. So it depends on what your customer's expecting as a solution.
Great. Okay, so from Tony Baker, if a bird should enter a food processing unit, is it imperative that it be removed quickly? Hang on a minute, sorry, they've sent them in 2 questions. Sorry, let me just get right. So if a bird should enter a food processing unit, it is imperative that it be removed or dispatched quickly. What is the protocol for dealing with NA in these instances?
So within a food processing production plant, they can apply for a site-specific license for controlling things like starlings, sparrows that get inside, and they can have a license issued at the start of the year. Each year they apply for that license. So speak to your customer and work with them on Natural England's website, or certainly DEFRA's. They can apply for a special license that actually allows them to control birds in that scenario where it's preserving food safety.
Good stuff. I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll leave it there. So so Sinclair Walton, what's the other alternative to Hawkeye as the gulls become very smart and intelligent to it?
Hawkeye's it depends on whether you mean Hawkeye's in terrorize and sort of the decoy dummy birds. So that as a standalone solution, I wouldn't ever argue they're going to solve the problem, but they can be used with other methods, so bioacoustics, other visual deterrents as well, to try and solve a problem. You may need to combine it with falconry and egg and nest removal. But as you say, birds are smart. So even with bioacoustics and Hawkeyes and so on, if the birds realise that that threat isn't real and doesn't ever leave, they will learn to ignore it. So sometimes you need to introduce a real threat, i.e. a predatory bird, or something like a laser deterrent, which they perceive to be a physical threat, that's what they fly away from. But using it as a standalone is unlikely on any medium or high pressure scenario it will work by itself.
Yeah, that integrated approach is always the best, isn't it? I've got one more question. So do you know what? Let's get it in, and then we've cleared the board. So from Steve Middleton, is there going to be another update on gull egg and nest removal services? And is there any other method than removal? I think that makes sense, does it?
Yeah, so I would argue that all the licenses are continuously under review at the moment. So BPCA maybe can answer some of that in terms of some of the reviews they're doing with DEFRA, but as I understand it, all of the licensing is under review, and a continuous reviews going on. So there may be changes. I'd expect changes within licensing, certainly within the next year or two. I'd imagine there'll be further changes continuously, how we report, who gets them, and so on. Is there any changes? Is there any other methods other than egg and nest removal? So, like we said here a moment ago, wait until the birds have dispersed and left the nest, proofing. But there isn't. You've got egg oiling, egg pricking, and so on. But again, that is only if you get that under a special license. It's still considered lethal methods of control. So, hopefully that answered it somewhat.
Great, good stuff. Thank you, Sean. Done an amazing job there, and. No work noise. That's good.
No, I know. No drilling. No kids.
No drilling going.
So it's worked out okay.
Great, brilliant. Thank you so much, Sean. Really, really appreciate that. We've got a virtual round of applause for you. Thank you.